Bookaholics is a safe place for reading junkies who obsess over books, authors, bookstores, book news, and book trivia. We'll nerd out with book reviews, author interviews, our habit, and other bookish things. Here is your host, Deirdre Pippins.
Hello, Mackenzie. Welcome to the Bookaholic podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yes, I'm glad you're here. You've written a nonfiction travel companion book called Beyond the Halls, and you felt very compelled to write such a book. Tell me why.
Yes, so my book, which I always keep right behind me for motivation, Beyond the Halls, An Insider's Guide to Loving Museums, I felt particularly compelled to write this book because I was doing a great deal of research into museums. And one of the things that I found to be most compelling and most important to me is that I love museums. I think they're special, and I would love for other people to recognize their specialness as well. But there's not a lot of accessible material for just the everyday reader when it comes to museums, especially in a lot of research I was doing. I was consuming a lot of very academic texts. And if not academic texts, you see all of those gift shop books that are guides to very specific places or regions or even just singular museums. So what I found was missing that I wanted to create was something that was a merge of the two, but that was accessible to give the everyday reader a big picture of museums, their history, their now, and why they matter for the future.
Right, exactly. And, I never thought about it because I'm always a person who's gone to museums and I love museums. So you have a friend in me. So it was never a second thought, but I do believe a lot of people aren't actually intimidated by museums because they're like, oh, I don't know art. I don't know that. It's kind of like wine. Some people are still intimidated by wines and what foods you should pair the wine with. And the same with museums. Oh, I'll go in there. For some people, it reminds them of school. So if you were not a good student, you don't want to go in there. Some people, it's actually, I don't like to go to old and dusty places. That's another thing.
Fair.
And then the third, the intimidation by what is there, the art. Oh, okay. Well, why? I don't like that art. It's ugly and everybody's admiring it.
Sure.
So you've got a lot of stuff going on in people's minds about museums.
Absolutely. And it's the thing that I want people to recognize is every museum won't be for you. But luckily, there are hundreds of different kinds. There are hundreds of different museums that exist. Everyone is different, and there are multiple different kinds. You don't have to love all of them. There's art museums, history museums, historic homes, natural history and science. There's all these different little subsections. There's even music museums, halls of fame, things like that. And libraries kind of tend to fall under the category of museums and archives as well. So yeah, not everyone will be for you. I know many a person who has a discomfort with contemporary art, especially this idea of, I could do that. Well, yeah, but you didn't.
Yeah.
This is the idea. So going in to appreciate contemporary art and recognizing contemporary ideas and patterns. But part of the reason that a lot of people feel uncomfortable or intimidated by museums is they don't have the greatest history of accessibility. They are working to do better now by their visitors to make museums a more accessible, more comfortable place. And so I don't blame them for not.
Right. Well, we're going to get into accessibility to the museum in a little bit. But let's break down. I love how you broke that down. And I listened on an audio, you defining museums. First of all, I never looked at museums that way. I always thought of museums as museums, if it was such and such museum. I never thought of historic homes as being a museum. So for an example, let's take a historic home. The Martin Luther King Jr. home in Atlanta. That is an example that a lot of people aren't thinking about, and a lot of people have visited, that who say possibly, oh, I don't like museums but that's a museum. And I thought that was very unique on how you brought that education to me, and we're going to spread that to everybody else, a historic home. I thought that was fascinating. Then you even went further to say, and I know a lot of people want to go visit the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But yeah, that's a museum. And then your very own library. I mean, in certain libraries, of course, the Library of Congress, in DC. So yeah, I just love the way you defined that. Is that an official definition of museums, or is that something you learned along the way?
So there is an official definition of museums, and I do list it out in my book. And so the International Council of Museums does have an official definition that they've actually recently modified slightly, but the definition from 2007 is: a museum is a nonprofit permanent institution in the service of society and its development, open to the public, which acquires, conserves, researches, communicates, and exhibits the tangible and intangible heritage of humanity and its environment for the purposes of education, study, and enjoyment. Now, that's a really long definition. But for me, a museum is a place that's open to the public that chronicles and preserves and researches human history in some aspect or some form of human heritage or culture.
Right, right. Well, it was a really long definition, but totally understandable. Totally understandable. I've seen a lot of long definitions that you're like, okay, wait a minute, I got to piece that with that, with that.
Yeah.
But that was totally understandable. And then that made me realize, as we were just speaking about libraries and historic homes, that said, oh yeah, that encapsulates all of those. And just a lot of people don't think about that. So I think if you get any nugget from this interview, it is that museums are a lot more expandable and open to your enjoyment beyond what you're thinking.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, now, when I think of museums, and this is before I even went there, the main museum, everybody, if you ask a person, what's the name of a museum? The first one that's going to pop in most people's heads is the Louvre in Paris. And they could have not even gone there, but we've heard enough of the Louvre throughout our lifetime for whatever reason. It's in movies, it's in books, it's all around. They've done a very good job of marketing that's just like the first museum that pops into your head. Now, so I have been there. It is wonderful. But when I did my European travels, I learned about the Tate in London. I didn't get to visit the Tate in London, but that's just as important as the Louvre. There's, so what would you say, in your opinion, what is your favorite and most important museum for you?
Okay. Favorite and most important, because that's the thing. You make an interesting point about, the Tate being as important as the Louvre. I mean, every museum is as important to the cultural preservation of the culture it's preserving and it's exhibiting. So each museum is going to be specifically important to a specific group of people. So I love your question, because for me, one of the most important museums, very personally and in my life, is the Houston Museum of Natural Science and History.
Oh, wow.
It's one of the most visited museums in the country. And I'm very fortunate to have grown up in a place in Houston with a really spectacular museum district. Lots of museums located in one little place. I grew up going to that museum quite often, whether it was for school or my parents would take me there. So I have a lot of fond memories. And I also feel that it is just really well executed in terms of accessibility, modern design. I could go on. But so it holds a special place in my heart, in my personal life.
Yes, yes, very good. I'm in the Charlotte, North Carolina MSA, and I grew up in Gaston County, which is to the west, a suburb of Charlotte. And always in the city of Gastonia in that county was the Shield Museum, which is a natural history museum. So that, I feel like, and especially during the time that I was a child, there was always a museum, in my parameters.
Mhm.
to go to, so that's a very good thing. I would say, let me just think, my most important museum, I guess if you take the true definition of the museum that you gave a little bit earlier, I would have to say MLK's house would be the most important for me, and possibly my favorite for the aspects of humanity and civility and
Mhm.
all of those positive things. But of course, the Louvre museum has the Mona Lisa, and I got to see her, and so that was phenomenal that I got to see that. And a lot of people don't realize the Mona Lisa is a lot smaller than portrayed
Yeah.
in movies and all of these things. It's a lot smaller. I mean, it's kind of like, it's not as small as this, of course. I don't want anybody to get this idea, but it's kind of like postage stamp sized,
It's
or
about
maybe
the
the
size
size
of a
of
piece of printer
paper.
paper. Yeah.
It's about this size. So yeah, so that just to be there and present and see that, oh my goodness,
Yeah.
I really see the size of the Mona Lisa. Just to get that's very important. And the Louvre Museum is full of all the the antiquities, Greek sculptures, which were phenomenal. Oh, I know what else I saw that I was really geeking out more so than the Mona Lisa was Winged Victory. And
Mm.
I remember studying that in school, and Venus de Milo. So the Venus de Milo, Winged Victory, and the Mona Lisa are at the Louvre. So yeah, that's why the Louvre is pretty important.
Yeah.
Now we also went to the Guggenheim.
Mhm.
So as a family, so I thought that was very different. But really, the really big thing about the Guggenheim is its architecture, which is phenomenal.
Yes.
So if you could tell us your top 3 museums in the world, we already know about the Houston,
Yes.
and what are your other 2?
Gosh, because there's so many factors that can play into what makes my top category. And I
Mhm.
probably have to go off of the experiences that I had when I was
Yeah.
there. So it's probably my top 3 most memorable museums. The Art Institute at Chicago, definitely
Mhm.
that's very high. Um,
Mhm.
the British Museum also ranks very high for me as well. Um, I recently had the fortune to visit the Tate Britain, and
Yeah.
that was I really enjoyed that quite a bit.
Okay.
Um, gosh, I know that's 3, but I'm going to throw in one more honorable
Go
mention.
ahead. Go
The,
ahead. Just
the
give a
Museum
caution
of
to the
Fine
wind.
the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston also holds a very special place in my heart, and I visited multiple times within the last several years. I found it to be quite a place of comfort during the pandemic. So,
Mhm. Mhm.
fortunately, it was open and available.
Yeah.
You could get your timed ticket and get in there and find comfort in the art. Um, so, yeah, those are definitely ranking high for me.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, let's talk about accessibility to museums. I mentioned earlier that I always grew up, at least in my geographic parameters, there was always at least the Shield Museum. We took school field trips to the
Mhm.
Shield Museum. My family would take me to the Shield Museum, just a local museum, but very important to our direct community.
Yeah.
So, when I was in the Louvre, although I was geeked out by all that I just told you, and the Greek statues of the antiquities,
Mhm.
and museums shift. Let's make sure we know that museums shift. That sometimes they'll bring in another collection, and so they do change.
Yes.
So, but I was disappointed that I did not see any African art. I was disappointed that I did
Mhm.
not see anything that was from the African diaspora, something that would connect me to my history, and culture. So, and it left us as a family wondering, well, where was the African art? Where was the Black art? And so not only are we talking about physical accessibility, but cultural accessibility and decolonizing the museums. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And so when we go to these museums that are supposed to be these worldly representations, like the Louvre, for example, they tend to conveniently leave out entire groups of the world.
Right.
And what's ironic about that is 90% of the collections on display of the African diaspora are on display outside of the continent of Africa, meaning that all of these things that belong to these people are not in their museums, they're elsewhere.
Right.
So
Right.
with that logic, we would think, oh, well, there should be a ton of stuff at the Louvre. But what is also important to mention is that all of the Louvre's collections, much with any other museum, there's only about 10% of what they have on display at any time. So they might have a ton of African diaspora art that they are holding hostage in their vault.
Right.
So that's where we get to the decolonizing museums. So I will say there are several museums in Paris that have recently started to deaccession their collections, and especially their African diaspora art, back to where it belongs. So that's an important note about Paris specifically.
Yes. There's a lot of things to touch base with on this. There's a book. Came out this year. It was something of a thief, and I'll put that down in the description box on my YouTube video and in the show notes on the podcast. I'll put the whole name of this book that I'm talking about. But apparently, it's about an Asian student of art.
Oh, Portrait of a Thief. Yes.
Right?
Portrait of a Thief.
Portrait of a Thief. Thank you, Mackenzie. And so he wants to get his culture's art back to where it belongs. And in one of the early scenes of Wakanda, you see the Michael B. Jordan character in a museum. He's in London, and there is this ancient tools of Africa on display. And although they're crooks, but they want to get that back, for the vibranium, I think it is. But anyway, it's still the concept of getting art back to where it belongs. So I would love to see more of that movement. I did enjoy, my family, we did enjoy last December. We visited the MoMA, which I am a member in New York, and they had a wonderful display of, I felt, equal for equal artists. You could see Picasso one moment, Matisse another moment, but then an African-American artist in another moment. So it was very well balanced, at least with their collections of last December. It was very, very well balanced, and I was very pleased about that.
That's definitely a merit of modern art museums. So for people who are feeling adverse to modern art, I'd say give it a shot, because it's one of the places where you're going to see on display more of the ideals of our modern world, which is more equality, more people, more representation.
Yes. And I believe that's also something, as you are growing in your museum travels, that you should gain, and maybe even ask the museum director or some of the docents that are walking around and saying, I would like to see more art that encapsulates our entire culture, and maybe find out what they have. Oh gosh, recently my husband and I visited Washington, D.C., and we went to the African Museum, the Sackler Museum, and it was just a very wonderful experience. I think we went to of course, we went to the African American Museum of History and Culture, and we had been there. That was our second time, but we never went to the bottom floor where it starts off with slavery and that whole thing. And that's a museum you got to go to. Yes, that's a museum you got to go to multiple times in order to get, because it's huge.
Yeah. That is a powerful exhibit. That was there. There are a few times in my life where I've cried in public.
Yeah.
And that is one of them, visiting the bottom
Yeah.
floor of that museum. But it's also just so well done and so worth the visit.
It really is. And I will say, now I'm a member of the Smithsonian as well, but I would say to people that you should, you know, even if you can't afford to travel, museums are a great way to get away. Start in your town,
Mhm.
start in your county, start in your region. Take a day trip, to a museum if you can't go on a vacation, and then just learn something else. I find a lot of times if a person is financially challenged or experiencing mental difficulties in their life at the time, sometimes going out of your just usual routine can help you cope and deal better. And visiting a museum, it could be one of them.
Can help you reconnect with your humanity. Get
Most
out of your
definitely.
rut.
Say that one more time.
Get out of your rut.
Yes,
Mhm.
yes, exactly, most definitely. Wow, and I have to give a shout out to the cover of your book. It is beautiful and very inviting. It is representative of what you're trying to tell people. So, who's responsible for that?
Well, I worked with a cover designer. So the idea for this cover came to me, I want to say in a dream, but it was one of those like you're laying in bed, you're pondering, and you go, and you got to like kind of write it down, right? I was like, I
Yeah,
want to have the cover. I want the cover to be like an art gallery, and I want the title to be like the piece of art, and I want like my name to be the name of the gallery, and I want the like object label to be the subtitle of the book. So
yeah,
I
right.
threw this to my cover designer along with a quick sketch. They gave me a first rendering, and I was like, I teared up a little bit, like seeing it. I
Oh,
was like, this is exactly what I was thinking. And then we
yeah,
iterated on a couple things, like picking the particular picture frame. I really wanted a
yes,
gold frame just because I love the gold frames in
I
museums.
do too.
And
I do.
picking a floor that looked kind of realistic and not too graphic-y. And then like the floor continues all the way to the back, which is kind of cool.
Yes, very nice, very nice. Now, I see this also, unless you already have it inside the book, as a companion journal to it. You ever thought about that?
I've considered it. I don't have currently a companion journal to this book, but you're not the first person who's given me that feedback. And there's a couple people who've told me I would love to read more museum guides from you. Like if you do a guide for every, I'm like, okay, can't do a guide for every museum, but I like where your head's at.
Yeah. Hey, I don't know. You might want to consider
Yeah,
what with your travel and tourism department. So
absolutely.
hey. But anyway, well, Mackenzie, I want to say thank you, thank you, thank you for bringing us this beautiful human um, companion to museums. I really appreciate it. It just can really enhance your life by visiting a museum.
Yeah. I mean, I could talk about them for a very long time, but I've enjoyed our time today.
Yes, most definitely. Well, everyone, we will have Mackenzie's contact information in the podcast show notes, as well as the description box below the YouTube video. And we will link you to the book, and you should pick it up. Since it seems so, I just can't wait to get my hands on a copy. I'm feeling so full now because I'm thinking about all the beautiful museums I've been to and that I'm going to go to.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Mackenzie, for your
Thank
time
you.
today.